Hey guys, it's Connor with EDMProd. In this video, I'm going to be showing you 10 tips to help you master Ableton's drum rack. So the first tip that we're going to be looking at is sends and returns within the drum rack. So just as how Ableton itself has sends and returns within the actual mixing section, you can actually set up sends and returns within drum rack. So I've got a drum rack here and I've got some samples preloaded, and let's try to add a send and return to this. So the first thing that I'll need to do is I'll need to click the Show Hide Chain List button. And you see this will pop out the chain list window to the right, and it's also going to pop up these three little buttons. So the S and R stand for send and return. So until I add a return channel, the send won't be activated. So the first thing I need to do is show the chain for these returns. Then I'm going to have this little drop area. So this is going to be where our return channels are going to be located. So in order to create a return channel, I'll need to drop any audio effect in. For this example, I'm just going to add a reverb send and then try sending some of my individual samples to it. So I'm going to go ahead and grab an Ableton stock reverb, and you'll see it's going to create a new channel here. And if I double click this, I can tweak the settings. So I'm just going to keep these default settings, except for I'm going to change the dry wet to 100% wet. So now that I have a return channel set up, you'll see that this send button is now able to be clicked. So I'm going to click it, and you'll see that this little send channel pops up. And now I can take any of these samples within my drum rack and send a little bit of them to this return. So I'm going to go ahead and send a little bit of the snare to it. Let's take a listen to what this drum loop sounds like dry first. Alright, so now I'm going to send a little bit of the snare to it, just add some reverb. Maybe let's try a little bit with the shakers too. Now, one of the main reasons that you would want to use these sends and returns within a drum rack is you want to add processing to some of the drum pads, but not all of them. For example, you probably don't want to add reverb to a kick, so if I were to send the entire group to a return reverb that I have set up, it would be sending some of the kick. So one of the main benefits of having these return channels within a drum rack is being able to select which samples you want to be processed. So the second tip that I'm going to show you guys is that you can actually add two samples to be triggered by one cell. Let's take a look at how to set this up. So I'm just going to go back to this initial screen, and what I'm going to need to do is with the Show Hide Chain List activated, I'm going to click the Input-Output section. So here you can see which notes are triggered by what and what's the key of the sample that they're playing. So for example, in this drum group, I've got two different clap sounds playing. And in my MIDI clip, they're playing at the exact same time, so it's a little bit redundant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add both of these claps to one pad, which means that once I play one, it's going to play both. So this first clap is at E1 on the drum pad, and the second clap is at G1. So this is pretty easy. All I have to do is set the receive to be the same for both of these. So I'm going to set this to E1, which was the same thing as the first clap. So as you'll see, instead of saying clap, it now has multi, which means that there's going to be multiple samples triggered by this. So I'm just going to click this, and if I play it, it's going to trigger both clap sounds. So this makes it super easy to layer sounds within a drum rack. One of the nice things about this is now I can just delete this note, and let's say I wanted to kind of change up whatever this progression is. I don't have to worry about changing both of the MIDI clips. So this is definitely a really big time saver, especially over the course of an entire track. The third tip that I'm going to show you guys is the concept of random sample selection. So I've got a drum group here, and I've got three different clap sounds. Let's take a listen to them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up this drum group so that it's going to randomly select one of these claps to play every time that the sample is triggered. So let's look at how to set this up. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a MIDI clip using Command-Shift-M. I'm going to click this, and I'm going to draw in a MIDI note for each of these claps so that they're all playing at the same time. So for this example, I'm just going to do quarter notes. So right now, as it's set up, Once this MIDI clip plays, it's going to trigger all 3 samples. Now, what I want to have happen is I want one of these claps to be randomly selected each one of these quarter notes. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to go grab the MIDI effect arpeggiator. The setup for this is pretty simple. There's only 2 things that I need to change. I'm going to change the rate to be 1/4 so that it matches the pattern that I wanted to play it at. And I'm going to change the style to random other. So that's all the setup that I need. So essentially what this arpeggiator is doing is it's going to randomly select one of these 3 MIDI notes to play every time that they're triggered. So let's take a listen to what this sounds like right now. One of the nice things about having this in place is that rather than having to select a random pattern myself, it's going to automatically do it for as long as I extend this MIDI clip. So, for example, let's just say that I repeated this clip 4 times to make it 4 bars long. It's going to select a different pattern for every one of these bars. So there's going to be no repeating patterns. It's going to be completely random, which will just add to the human variation and inconsistency for this loop. So I'm back with the same clap loop, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this arpeggiator and keep the original MIDI clip, which means that all 3 clap samples are triggered. Now this tip is a concept called copy value to sibling. So let's say, for example, that I want all of these 3 claps to be playing at once, but I don't like that they're all playing at full volume. So one thing that I can do is I can adjust the volume of one of these claps. I'm just going to set it to -20 so that the group is a little bit quieter. And if I right click on this parameter, there's a setting called copy value to siblings. Now what this is going to do is it's going to set the volume of both of these other clips to be the exact same volume of this first clip, which is -20 dBs. So if you'll check the other clips, they're now going to be set to -20. So this is a nice way to be able to adjust the value of all of these clips within a drum rack with just 2 clicks. So, we could use this in many other contexts. Maybe if we wanted to do a fade out, you can use this for almost any of the controls within the simpler housed in a drum rack. So the 5th tip is to use random panning within drum groups. So I'm just going to take this exact same drum group, and within the simpler, underneath the control section, you'll see this thing called random is greater than panning. So essentially, the higher the percentages, the more randomness that's going to be added to the global panning of this clip. So I'm just going to solo this first clap as I adjust it, and I'm going to bring the random panning up to 80%, which is pretty high. So let's take a listen to what that sounds like. Random panning is a great way to get more subtle adjustments, kind of stereo variation, especially when it comes to more percussion-based sounds like hi-hats or shakers. So one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to about 20%, and then I'm going to copy this value to the other claps. So now every one of these claps is going to have random panning applied to it, which is just going to add to the variation of this group. Let's take a listen. I'm going to bring that up to 50% just to make it a little bit more noticeable. Let's go 100% full just to see what that sounds like. So the next tip is the concept of choke groups. So what is a choke group? So inside drum rack, if we have the input-output section, you'll see there's this column called choke. So these 16 different values that you can set each of these samples to. So if 2 samples are in the exact same choke group, that means that once one is triggered, the other is going to be silenced. The most classic use of this is to set a closed hat and an open hat in the exact same choke group. This means that once one plays, the other will be silenced. The reason for this is that in the real world, a drummer cannot play an open hat and a closed hat at the exact same time because they're played on the same cymbal. So let's listen to this loop without any choke groups applied, and then let's add this closed hat and open hat to a choke group. So pay attention to how this open hat falls into this closed hat, but it still plays through the bar. Alright, so I'm going to select both the open hat and the closed hat, and I'm going to assign it to choke group 1. So I'm going to play this loop and notice how this open hat shuts off immediately once this closed hat is triggered. Just to emphasize this, I'm going to solo both of these hats to give you guys a better idea of what's going on. And now in context. The next tip is pad hot swap. So let's just say I've got a drum group and I don't like what one of the samples is and I want to switch it out for another sample. The quickest way to do this is using the pad hot swap button. So let's just say I wanted to change this shaker. If you hover over any of these pads, you'll see this little refresh arrow that pops up. So this is going to be the pad hot swap button. So if I click this, it's going to open up my browser, and from there I can find another sample that I'd rather have playing. Sure. So if some of you have been working in Ableton for a while, you might have come across the concept of default presets, in particular when it comes to audio effects like an EQ or compressor. Now you can use default presets with nearly anything inside Ableton, including the drum rack. So how can we do this? The setup is pretty simple. All you have to do is bring in a drum rack onto a MIDI channel, tweak it until you have the settings that you'd like to be your default settings, right-click on the drum rack, and then click Save as Default Preset. So what are some options that you could have? Well, you could have some default send and return setup. You can maybe have an EQ on the main 16 pads and so on and so forth. So this next tip applies to those of you that want to add a little bit more punch and body to your drum sounds within a drum rack. So I've got this little snare roll. Let's listen to it right now. So a common technique when it comes to layering bass sounds is to add another bass sound that's an octave up from the other bass, which will help it punch out of like laptop speakers a little bit more while you still have the nice strong body of the original sample. Now, not only can you do that with bass sounds, but you can also do that with drum sounds. So for example, I've got this snare right now. What I want to do is I want to layer in another version of the snare that's an octave up. So let's just take a listen to what this snare is going to sound like an octave up. I'm going to switch the transpose to 12 just to pitch it up by 12 semitones. Original. So what's the easiest way to do this? So I'm going to grab a MIDI effect and I'm going to bring the chord onto this snare. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the value of shift 1 to be 12. What this is going to do is it's going to layer on another version of the snare, but an octave up. And then I can use the velocity below this shift 1 to set how loud that I want the second snare sample to be. So I'm going to go ahead and tweak this and layer in another version of the snare, an octave up. So as you can see, the setup for this is pretty quick and simple, so it's a good way to add a little bit more body and punch to a sample. Now, the last tip isn't necessarily a secret tip, but it's definitely something that I overlooked for a while, and I'm sure that you guys have too. So within Ableton, there is a host of all of these preset and default drum racks. So I don't know how many of you guys have actually gone through them, but there's a lot of really good samples in them. I'm sure most of you have your sample pack folders that you normally go to, but don't forget and don't neglect the fact that these are here. You know, they have more acoustic sounding ones that are really good, and they also have more digital kind of techno sounding ones, so they've got a good wide range for whatever you're going into. I generally find myself using them when I need more percussion samples. There's a host of different drum racks, and it's nice that most of them have these little demos that play when you click them. So that wraps it up for this video. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or to email me at connor@edmprod.com. That's CONNOR@edmprod.com. Have a good one.